Britain's rental sector is in a state of crisis, but don't just take my word for it. Both Labour and the Conservatives agree that changes need to be made, and the government could bring in new reforms ahead of the next general election. But what exactly needs to be done, and is it a case of too little, too late to win back certain voters? To discuss all that and more, I'm joined by the academic and journalist Anna Minton, who has regularly written on housing. Anna, thanks for joining us. We're on a side street here in Brixton. You moved here towards the mid-late 90s. The area's changed a lot since then. What's your reflections of that time?
This street here, which is right in the heart of Brixton, it's just off the main square. These blocks were really run down. And now I know that a lot of these properties are really expensive, private rented accommodation in excess of £2,000 a month. That sort of gives you an idea of how it's changed. You know, this was really affordable housing, and now it's not for the majority of Londoners. The whole area's really changed. The whole of London has gentrified massively, and an area like Brixton, which is really well located, nice houses, lots of things to do for young people, bars and restaurants. It's a kind of real hot spot, but it's not in any way unusual. And then it spreads outwards, because what you see is that people can't afford to live in Brixton, so they move a little bit further out into other parts of South London. They move to Peckham. That's now the new front line of gentrification. But then you also have parts of the city which have been completely redeveloped. Council estates have been knocked down. All of these luxury apartments have been built. So up the road in Elephant and Castle, the centre of Elephant and Castle has been completely changed. That's a different type of gentrification, I'd say. A much more proactive, violent actually type of gentrification, but it's the same sorts of processes and it has the same impact, which means that the original communities can no longer afford to live there because property prices have just gone through the roof, and we couldn't afford to live in Brixton. I mean, we moved because even when we moved, which was now 10 years ago, house prices had already gone up so much.
You wrote an article for a national newspaper that said the reconfiguration of London is akin to social cleansing. 10 years on, does it still feel as though that social cleansing is still in full force? These
processes have really accelerated over the last decade. They're going at a far greater pace than that they were then. The point I was trying to make then, and will still make now, is that everything changed after the financial crash in 2008. All of these processes of gentrification were, very much underway, and, it's just part of the sort of post-industrial kind of capitalist picture, gentrification actually. But after the financial crash, we had all of these changes to our financial system. So one of the really big ones was quantitative easing, which is the creation of trillions of pounds and dollars of new money to bail out the banks. And actually all of this money went disproportionately into assets, disproportionately into property. And that's a really big reason for property price inflation. And at the same time, we also had the increasing role of private equity companies come into the picture. Global private equity come and buy up lots and lots of property in areas like this. So these processes really accelerated. Since then, we had as much quantitative easing during COVID as we had during the whole post-financial crash period. So it's been a policy that's one of the main factors behind soaring inflation throughout London, other towns and cities, throughout the UK. So yeah, those processes have got way worse. And in the face of that, that juggernaut, local communities are pretty powerless, unfortunately, to do anything about it, and they can't cope with those rising prices, and of course people get pushed out.
The average rental price in London is kind of aligned to 40% of the average Londoner's income. That just
I
isn't
think it's
sustainable.
more than that. Research shows that if you're paying more than 30% of your income on rent or mortgage, then that has a detrimental impact on mental health.
It's not just really a London problem. This is seen across all cities across the
Yeah,
UK.
absolutely. Well, it's the same forces, which are affecting towns and cities across the country, disproportionately in London, because this is the financial centre. This is such a large global city where foreign investment is particularly focused on London. But other cities, Bristol, Cardiff, York, Manchester, Liverpool, Edinburgh, you just have to look at their skylines. They've got the ubiquitous luxury apartments in the city centre going for such high prices. Manchester is completely transformed from what it was.
Is it a case of councils sort of not being able to get around loopholes around planning permission? Obviously social housing, that's sort of fallen away in terms of the share of types of properties in the country, the rise of private developers, the buy-to-let market sort of exploding house prices. What are sort of the driving factors?
Councils have been very, very keen to partner with really big property companies like Lend-Lease, who've built Elephant Park in Elephant and Castle, which was on the site of the former Haygate estate. I think for councils, they're in a situation where they have no money. Their budgets have been cut by 40%, and this partnering with a really large developer, it's the only game in town. They see it as the only way. They would call it cross-subsidy. They will allow a big developer in partnership with them to build a really large scheme, and they will say, well, a percentage of that has to be affordable housing. And that would be their justification. But actually, the definition of affordable housing was changed under the Conservative government to mean up to 80% of market rent or market value. So in a place like Elephant Park, you have 25% of affordable housing, but when the average two-bedroom flat costs £1 million, 80% of £1 million is not affordable to, the majority of Londoners.
The solutions, do they lie in things like rent controls, or is it
rent controls are used in all sorts of towns and cities in other countries. They're not a particularly radical policy. Actually, the Mayor of London, has been researching around these sorts of areas, but I think that's very far from being recognised in any sort of policy, because we've just had a really ideological approach to housing, that the market can sort it out. Well, the market clearly isn't sorting it out. European countries have a really buoyant rented sector. It might be cooperative housing, it might be private rented housing, but it's a secure rented sector, whereas here we've got the shortest tenancies in the world. You can have a 6-month tenancy and then get kicked out. There's lots of discussion around ending those no-fault evictions. That might happen, but actually the level of precarity is going to stay really high, and tenants don't have much recourse to dealing with really poor conditions and all of the sorts of things that generation rent have to suffer on a daily basis. There just isn't that appetite to intervene in how the private sector operates, and Labour is also very timid about doing that. At the same time, there's a fear that if things get harder for buy-to-let landlords, which they are getting much harder because of interest rates, actually it's making less sense for people to rent properties through buy-to-let because their mortgages are now doubling. So they are pulling out of the market, and that's why the private rented sector is in an even worse position than it was this time last year. Rents have gone up so much, but that's also because landlords are passing on those costs that they're facing because of soaring interest rates.
There's a certain irony because these market forces and these government policies has dubbed a lot of people within millennials and Gen Z as generation rent, but these current forces are also meaning that a lot of people actually can't even get onto the rental ladder in the first place.
No, absolutely. I mean, housing is one of the biggest problems I'm sure that, for young people like you, it's, one of the biggest worries and concerns. And when I was your age, I had other things to worry about for sure, but housing wasn't the same. It was relatively easy to get private rented accommodation if you had a reasonable job.
Interesting. So should we explore a bit more of Brixton and talk about the current situation?
Sure.
Cool. Labour and the Conservatives agree that changes need to be made to the system, but Do you feel as though enough is actually being said by either party to actually instigate what's needed?
Housing is at the top of the political agenda now in a way that it never used to be, but it's not the only part of the domestic policy picture which is collapsing. One of the really key problems is that it is led by the 5-10 major developers, and they are the biggest donors to the Conservative Party and probably other parties as well.
We've come to this estate here in Brixton, home to a lot of social homes. Social housing was seen as a tonic, I suppose, to the private rental sector, but of course the balance within the market is quite skewed now. What kind of happened to social housing?
The really big thing was Margaret Thatcher's right to buy policy. And the key issue isn't actually so much the sell-off of the council homes, is that councils were not allowed to use the money from those sales to build new homes. So the social housing stock has been, absolutely decimated. 2 million homes have been taken out of it. It's also that the long-term impact, perhaps unintended consequences, is that those original right-to-buy owners have now sold their homes on to private landlords, the majority of whom are professional private landlords who might own, 100 properties, 300 properties. And so what you get on an estate like this is that actually identical flats are rented out in the private sector for 3 and 4 times the price of the flat next door, which is still owned by the council or the housing association.
Last year, the government actually did release a white paper, a plan essentially for reforming the rental sector, which among its headlines included the removal of Section 21 notices, a national decent homes standard. Yeah. What did you make of their plan?
It is a good thing that Michael Gove has said they're going to ban Section 21. It is a good thing that he's said a lot more social housing needs to be built. The Conservatives never used to mention the phrase social housing before, so there's a realisation now of what needs to be done, but it's still not being done.
What needs to happen to housing in Britain?
I would say we need to have a real commitment to building a large amount of social housing, the same sort of commitment that we had in the post-war period. There was a crisis around housing in the post-war period, and it was met with, a real commitment to build social housing. We need to get back to that. We need to build social housing, but we also need to have a completely different look at how the private rented sector operates, and we have to have a completely different look at how the owner-occupied sector operates. And at the moment, housing policy, the government is completely in hock to the top 10 house builders who have a monopoly over the situation. And they are answerable to their shareholders. That's what that's their motivation. It's not actually providing the housing that people need.
Anna, it's a bit of a bleak state of affairs, but thanks for outlining that in such good detail.
Thank you.